So, on to the actual conference. I think I'm about 2 minutes early, but if I talk slowly, that's okay because there's a lot to say about Emile DeVito, and I'm going to introduce him and let him get started with his presentation. Let me tell you a little bit about Emile. Emile has been involved. He's been a leading voice in plant and animal conservation in New Jersey for more than 30 years in New Jersey, through his work with the New Jersey Conservation Foundation, the Pinelands Preservation Alliance, the New Jersey Natural Lands Trust, and the New Jersey Endangered and Non-Game Species Committee. He specializes in birds and vegetation and landscapes of the New Jersey Pine Barrens, and he's currently working on the protection of rare plants and snakes in the Pine Barrens. And I can actually attest to this. He's also a lot of fun to go on walks with in the forest, looking for rare plants that are hiding behind walls of, in one case at least, invasive species. But it is a great, he's a great guy to go on hikes with, and gives great presentations. And today he's going to kick off our conference speaking about New Jersey's rich forest biodiversity. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Emile can share his screen. I do want to mention that if you have any questions for Emile, please post them in the Q&A section down below. And at the end, I will be managing his Q&A so that he can then, we can try to get through as many questions as possible before we move on to the next speaker. So without further ado, take it away, Emile. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. I'm actually sitting at Brown University in Rhode Island, and got here nice and early to be ready for this. We're going to go on a whirlwind tour of New Jersey's forested landscapes. So strap into your seatbelts, and here we go. Here's sunrise from Apple Pie Hill in the New Jersey Pine Barrens, looking out over the vast sea of pine and Atlantic white cedar forests, looking out toward the coast. A spectacular photograph by Al Horner. So we're gonna cruise through the entire state of New Jersey. Before we do that, I just want to show you my three kids holding one of our prized research animals, a northern pine snake in the Pine Barrens. On the left is my daughter Natalie, who's here at Brown, and I'm visiting her for the day. So we're going to start in the highlands. Here's a white pine forest on a rock ledge high in the highlands. There are a lot of species here that are used to poor soil conditions, dry conditions, low nutrients on top of the ledge. It's almost like a mini Pine Barrens stuck on top of a rich forest on one of the highlands ridges. Here's a floodplain on the Raritan River in Johnson's Park in Piscataway in New Brunswick. Some of the biggest, oldest trees in New Jersey are in some of our major floodplains of our big rivers because they tend to be somewhat ignored by various forces that tend to take away big trees. And, you know, our floodplains in the north are disturbed by floods, and therefore they often are subject to invasion by invasive species. So that's an area in need of restoration. Here's a burned area in the Forked River Mountains in the Pine Barrens with Atlantic white cedar swamp in the background. Tremendous difference between north and south in New Jersey. Here's a coastal holly and cedar, red cedar forest on Island Beach State Park on Barnegat Bay. Some of these photos are taken from historic slides taken by Brooks Everett in the 1960s and 70s. And I like to use these slides because they look back to a time before some problems that we see today with deer and invasive species became so prominent. Here's an unditched tidal marsh in the preserve in Dividing Creek in Cumberland County, owned by the Natural Lands Trust of Media, Pennsylvania, one of the few unditched tidal marshes left on the East Coast. Incredible species diversity, including some rare plants. And finally, here's the tip of Cape May, the monarch butterflies in migration in late summer, early fall. So that's 212 miles from High Point to Cape May. And the biodiversity that you could find in the central part of our country is equivalent to being in the North Wisconsin to Southern Illinois. Species that span 600 or 700 miles in the middle of the country are crammed into our tiny little state, 212 miles from High Point to Cape May, because of the juxtaposition of the continental climate and the maritime climate, and our amazing geology, which comprises so many different soil types. Here's the geologic bedrock map of New Jersey. Hopefully all of you are familiar with our physiographic provinces, from the Ridge and Valley, which is part of the Great Valley that goes all the way to the Shenandoah in the upper extreme northwest. Then the New England Highlands, mostly in brown there, stretching out of New England and New York State through the good portion of Sussex and Passaic and Morris County, all the way to the Delaware River. Then the incredible Piedmont with its lava flows, the Watchung Mountains, the Sourland Mountains, the Palisades, and all of the shale and eroded rock that came out of the giant mountains that used to be in the highlands. And then finally, the coastal plain. The intercoastal plain is sort of greenish and is Cretaceous soil, some of the richest soil in the world. Unfortunately, most of those forests are gone or have been turned into farms, and now lately warehouses and all sorts of other highways and developments. There are a few left. And then finally, the outer coastal plain, which not only houses the Pine Barrens, but also the maritime forests, Delaware Bay forests on fairly rich soils. So the outer coastal plain is not just the Pine Barrens, it's also incredibly rich. And we'll try to look at all of those places today. Here's a photograph of a hemlock grove in Wawayanda State Park, a northern type forest with many northern species. Also adjacent to the hemlock groves are our northern sugar maple forests. So it's like a little slice of the Catskills or the Adirondacks. And you can find many northern species in these areas, things like A-wings in the Polyglaceae, and they're rich in the various trillium species where they haven't been browsed by deer, especially on protected areas and cliffs and near waterfalls and places like that. And then here's a fast-flowing stream, trout streams with our C1 waters, the highest water quality, sassafras in bloom in the early spring. Great places in the summertime on these stream sides and the little ebbs and flows of the river for cardinal flower in some of the backwaters. And then just to mention that cardinal flower blooms first in the north and later in the south because it's timed with the migration of ruby-throated hummingbirds as they move from north to south. And of course, our forests are filled with nutrient-rich fruits with high lipid content, such as dogwoods and spicebush. These fruits are sometimes as much as 70% oils and fats, and they power bird migration. Spicebush is one of the most important plants that you could possibly have to power the migration of our fruit-eating birds. Here's a plant without any nutrients. It's a mimic Indian cucumber root. The fruits are pretty much nutrient poor, but the background of the leaves turns red to highlight the black fruits for migratory birds passing overhead. And even though the fruits are nutrient poor, the color pattern mimics that of nutrient-rich fruits, and it fools juvenile birds. So a young wood thrush or a young hermit thrush might eat the fruit of an Indian cucumber root in its first year. And then it realizes that they don't have any good nutrients, doesn't eat them anymore. But every year there are new juvenile birds to fool. Another interesting thing that goes on in our forest is fruit flagging. So many species turn color early, such as poison ivy and Virginia creeper and dogwood and black gum. And they give up on photosynthesis at the beginning of bird migration in order to advertise the fact that they have fruits to power bird migration from a great distance. The birds can see these colors and they know where to zero in. Here's a black gum branch turning red even in late August. And that's an indication that there's fruit nearby. Here's a beechwood in Mercer County in the Piedmont with a mayapple understory. This photo is about 35 years old, and it's interesting. Beech woods are very shady, so they're filled with spring ephemerals, or they should be filled with spring ephemerals if the deer haven't done too much damage to them. And of course, the beech woods get very shady in the summers, that they lack a lot of shrubs, but they should be rich in spring ephemerals that come out and do their photosynthesis mostly before the leaves emerge. Things like bloodroot are another example of a spring ephemeral. And here's a geometric moth laying its eggs on a bloodroot. Feeding on a bloodroot flower. You can't see the flower; it's buried under the moth. A coastal forest of Delaware Bay, incredibly thick, dense oak pine forests, mostly deciduous because the soils are better. They don't burn very often, as in the central pine barrens. And these are the first forests that migratory birds see on their way north. Here's a scarlet tanager that was so exhausted crossing, somewhere in the South Atlantic and landing in the Delaware Bay shore in New Jersey, that I was able to walk right up to it and take its photograph this was a photograph taken with one of those little Instamatic cameras about 40 years ago. When they land at the end of a long flight over the ocean, it takes them a few hours to resupply their muscles with oxygen. And so you can often walk up to a flock of migratory birds early in the morning that has just landed. Now, our deciduous forests are supposed to regenerate themselves through gap phase ecology. Old trees fall down, create gaps. They might be diseased, they might fall in a storm. And those gaps are supposed to be filled with young seedlings and saplings of so many trees. In this particular photo, the gap doesn't have any seedlings and saplings in it. It's barren because of heavy deer browse. This is in Jockey Hollow many years ago. And then, of course, if the soil has been heavily disturbed by agriculture, here's another shot of an empty gap with a barberry plant coming up in it. And if the soil was disturbed many years ago by agriculture, if you have a post-agricultural forest, it might be that's what we see now with a lot of our dead ash forests, right? The post-agricultural forest that grew up after World War I, mostly composed of ashes and other sun-loving species. The places where the ash trees are all dying, we don't have any native species in the understory anymore because the past agriculture ruined the soil. It raised the pH, changed the nutrient status of the upper soil horizons. They're often invasive earthworms, gobbling up all the organic material, and you end up with a meadow of Japanese stiltgrass, which is, I think, one of our biggest threats to our recovering forests, our post-agricultural forests, and poses a huge restoration challenge. I don't think anybody knows what to do with these places other than burn them and somehow try to start all over again. Here's a beautiful wetland in the Great Swamp in Morris County, filled with high bush blueberry and all sorts of fantastic grasses and meadow species, great for pollinators. Here's a beautiful New England aster, spireas. And then, of course, on the edges of wetlands, where the soil's a little bit more mucky and wet, the wonderful marshmallows. Here's a view from Pyramid Mountain Park, saved by a lady named Lucy Meyer a number of decades ago. Pyramid Mountain in Morris County. If you go there, you can go visit Tripod Rock, which is an amazing giant boulder balanced on 3 other small stones. And here's Town Bog in the Newark watershed, where it's a slice of Canada, black spruce, and all sorts of northern species that you'd find in the lower edges of the boreal forest or the spruce and fir forests of Canada. There was one fantastic bog, which before we had wetlands laws, unfortunately it's been filled in. It's now the Rockaway Mall off of Route 80. We have wetlands laws, thank God, and we have to hope that our politicians don't ever weaken them. They've been weakened in most of the rest of the country, but New Jersey has stood firm and hasn't weakened our wetlands laws yet. It's hard to make any laws stronger right now, although recently the DEP did make our floodplain and riparian rules a little bit stronger, which was great. I mean, that's the first time something's been strengthened in a while. And And we hope we can continue to strengthen our environmental regulations instead of emasculating them. Okay, so here's another view of a pin oak forest in the Great Swamp along the Passaic River. Again, great places for bird migration. Some of these are post-agricultural forests, unfortunately, because they were heavily used in the 1900s for farming with ditches and draining the wetlands. And so the understories are not all that spectacular anymore. But there's a good chance, I think, that there's places where some of these can be restored, especially if deer are inhibited. I have study plots in some of these forests where we put up deer fences only encompassing areas as large as a tennis court. And the native plants have actually kicked out the invasive species in the absence of deer for about 25 years. Urban rivers are really important for migration, for recreation, for peace and solitude in our congested areas. And again, even though they're highly invaded, Japanese knotweed, unfortunately, is really invading our urban rivers and even our rural rivers now. Japanese knotweed is spreading like crazy throughout all of our riparian systems. And I believe there's some testing at Bulls Island State Park of a natural insect biological control agent for Japanese knotweed. I don't know how it's been going. I haven't been able to check up on that lately, but we're hopeful that at some point biological control can help us out with Japanese knotweed the way it helped a great deal with the purple loosestrife. This is the Raritan River in New Brunswick. Look at this magnificent ancient poison ivy vine in the floodplain here. It's almost a foot thick at its base. Poison ivy is an incredibly important plant for bird migration. The fruits are coated with wax, just like red cedar cones. And these waxy fruits, also the bayberry and some of the other species that have waxy fruits are really important for bird migration because birds can digest wax as if it was sugar. The milk snake is probably our most attractive snake in the Piedmont in North Jersey and in other parts of New Jersey. And of course, all the snakes are in hibernation now. In places like this, many of the snakes hibernate in holes, stump holes, old animal burrows, and get either in the water table in the case of rattlesnakes or very close to the water table where the temperatures don't fluctuate much underground so that they don't freeze. And we'll spend a little bit of time in the Pine Barrens. This is a pitch pine in one of the very open dune-like areas. There are many important dune-like areas in the Pine Barrens. Here's just a map showing. Now, a lot of people say Pinelands. You should never say Pinelands, right? Because it's not the Pinelands, it's the Pine Barrens. The Pinelands is a government agency. The Pine Barrens are the ecosystem. I have no idea, other than the fact that I think they didn't like the word barrens when they created the Pinelands Protection Act. Thanks to Governor Byrne in the 1970s, the Pinelands Protection Act was created, creating this very complicated zoning map on the right. The dark, the preservation area is that large light green area. In the middle is the agricultural area, the cranberry area centered around Chatsworth. And then in the southern part of the Pine Barrens is the forest corridor known as the forest area. You can see those dark green areas are the forest area, and they surround the preservation zone. And then the various bright colors are the areas where development can occur. Development was transferred out of the conservation zones and into the growth zones. The red spots are tiny little existing villages that basically are pretty much like they always were in the 1970s, where there's the existing growth is there, but there's not much new growth. And of course, the preservation area is highly protected, and the dark green forest area is somewhat protected. The yellow areas are agricultural. So that's the Pinelands scheme. The Pinelands Protection Act scheme was the first transferred development right protection area in the country and the most successful one to date. So we're really, really lucky in New Jersey. If we didn't have the Pinelands Protection Act, there would be no point. It would be gone. It would be retirement villages as far as the eye could see. And there would be no point talking about the Pine Barrens anymore. Here's a view of open space in New Jersey in green. New Jersey's incredibly lucky. Our Green Acres program in the past 63 years, along with nonprofits and counties and municipalities, we've saved a couple of million acres. And we need to save another million. There's a big report coming out soon about what we need to do in order to reach 50% of our, I'm sorry, did I say 2 million? We've saved 1.5 million acres. We need to save another 1.5 million. We need to get over 50% if we want to protect our biodiversity. And we need to do that in the next 15 or 20 years, because otherwise New Jersey will be completely built out after that. We do have a great percentage of open space. We've done a tremendous job, but it's tremendously expensive. Obviously, real estate's very expensive in New Jersey, and we have to commit to saving another 1.5 million acres. Okay, I just want to spend a few minutes on the New Jersey Conservation Franklin Parker Preserve. We were really fortunate to be able to acquire it from the DeMarco family, the Cranberry family. It connects up Wharton State Forest with Brendan Burns State Forest and Bass River State Forest in and around Chatsworth. And this is an older map. In the last couple of years, almost all of the white in the central part of this map has been acquired by either New Jersey Conservation Foundation or the state of New Jersey, so that it's one giant green swath running from Wharton State Forest over to Bass River and Burn, which is the Conservation Foundation now owns about 14 to 15,000 acres, and anything that we don't own has pretty much been filled in by the state of New Jersey. So we're really, once again, very lucky. Here's just an aerial view of the Wading River south of Chatsworth and east of Highway and west of Highway 563. Magnificent twisting, turning rivers with oxbow lakes and wetlands, all sorts of wonderful species in the wetlands, especially the orchids and the lilies. Here's a spung, sort of a vernal pond in the Pine Barrens, and the brownish, what appears to be brownish grass in the middle is Pine Barrens reed grass, fairly rare species. And there's a moth, one species of moth that requires Pine Barrens reed grass in order to survive. It lays its eggs on the roots and the caterpillars, and use the roots and stems for their survival. Here's laurel leaf catbrier, one of the Pine Barrens catbriers. It's evergreen. You can find this along river systems in some of the less disturbed areas in the Pine Barrens. Kind of an interesting catbrier species, Smilex walteri, I believe. And here is bog asphodel. New Jersey Conservation Foundation, with its Forked River Mountain Preserve and with its Franklin Parker Preserve, is entrusted with some of the biggest remaining populations of bog asphodel. And Jay Kelly has been studying these populations for quite a bit of time. And so much bog asphodel was discovered on our preserves that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided that it did not need to be a candidate species anymore for threatened and endangered status, because it was found to be much more common than they had believed. Here's beautiful Rexia mariana, the red meadow beauty, found on gravelly, moist sand on the edges of wetlands. Wonderful species, a tropical family, the Melastomataceae. Of course, pitcher plants, the insect-eating plants, along with all the sundews and the bladderworts and many of the other species that use insects to supplement their diet to obtain nitrogen in the nutrient-poor, acid Pine Barren soils. Here's threadleaf sundew in bloom. Here's white-fringed orchid taken at Webb's Mills flower bog. Beavers have recently been wreaking havoc with many of these meadows in the Pine Barrens. Beavers have become so abundant, and they're damming up culverts because there are so many roads that cross wetlands from the old industrial days in the Pine Barrens. And the culvert pipes are too small because all these roads were built in the absence of beaver. They had been trapped out. They were pretty much non-existent. And no one has taken them into account in terms of having culverts across tiny little sand roads through wetlands. And now beavers are plugging up all these culverts and drowning spectacular sites, cedar swamps, wetland meadows. And we really need to eliminate a lot of these roads. A lot of we're going to need all your help. Hopefully very soon, the DEP has promised that they're going to come out with a plan to limit off-road vehicles in Wharton State Forest and really start to crack down on all the tremendous damage by off-road vehicles. And it's going to be really controversial. The off-roading community is going to be up in arms, and we need to work really hard to make sure that the DEP doesn't back down. Here's some recovery of a pine forest after a very hot wildfire. Obviously, the recovery is very fast in terms of the shrub layer from the roots. The pines, in this particular instance, this was a really, really hot fire, and some of the pines actually died, which is kind of unusual. Even in most wildfires, many of the pine trees don't die. They simply resprout from the trunks or the roots. You can see some in the background have resprouted a little bit from their trunks. This was a really hot fire and came in April, and that's the fire season in the Pine Barrens, when the sun heats up the forest floor before the shrubs leaf out, and the forest floor dries out, and then fires can get really hot. And that's when you get most tree death, is when you have those mid to late April wildfires before the shrubs and oak shrubs and all the other huckleberries and blueberries have leafed out. There's a seed pod emerging from a flower head right now in early November. And I'll give you a few moments to think about what this might be before I reveal it. All right, there's the dried up flower petals are the lower part of the picture, and the seed pod is emerging. And it is this plant, Pine Barrens gentian. I think it's the most beautiful flower in the state. And we're managing for it at many of our preserves in the Pine Barrens by mowing the shrubs every few years and in the wintertime, and burning the land. And the gentians just respond fantastically from mowing and burning in the wintertime. Here's the rarest plant in the Northeast, American chaffseed. Jay Kelly at Raritan Valley College has discovered that this is hemiparasitic. The seeds need to land on the roots of one very few plants, usually a Maryland golden aster, but sometimes a grass such as a little blue stem. And the seedlings parasitize the host plant roots for a few years before they can live on their own. And of course, this plant used to grow from Cape Cod to Cape Hatteras. There's one population in New Jersey near Whitesbog in the pines, and a new population has been found somewhere in Cape Cod near an airstrip. And we're trying to create experimental populations of these in appropriate habitat in the Pine Barrens, now that Jay Kelly has figured out how to grow the things on the host plants. Oh, there's breadleaf sundew again. And here's curly grass fern. This is a Brooks Everett photo from about 1960 at Packham Pond. And these are obviously the spore fronds of the curly grass fern. And this is, of course, likely endemic. I think it used to be found in Delaware. I'm not sure if it's there anymore, so it might be endemic to New Jersey. There's some thought that it also might be at a few sites in the Andes of South America, in the high Andes, but we're not sure if that's the same species or not. Here's southern twigblade, Listera australis. And this plant, Howard Boyd only saw it about 3 times in his entire life, writing those Pine Barrens field guides when he was between 80 and 95 years old. He had only seen it 3 times. Thought it was one of the rarest orchids in the pines. And lately, in the last 15 years or so, it seems like it's just exploding. Almost every sphagnum in every maple or cedar swamp with a little bit of sun coming in, you can find southern twayblade now. So it's just all of a sudden, probably a result of climate change, this plant is just expanding its population density here in the north. Here's a picture of Howard at the DeMarco monument buried deep in Wharton State Forest. The state didn't want Garfield DeMarco to put up a monument They wouldn't let him put up a little sign about the town of Friendship where his ancestors had settled and started the cranberry and blueberry industry. And so he just had this gigantic monument commissioned, and he brought it in there on his own and just dropped it there. And of course, no one can take it out because it's, you know, half the size of a Volkswagen bus. So it's pretty funny. It had said, yes, you can put up a sign, there'd just be a little plaque somewhere on a tree. So that's kind of funny. And that's Howard. He was one of the most spectacular people. Just knew so much about the Pine Barrens and was so willing to share the information and lead people around. And when he was getting frail, he said one day he wanted to show me where this was because I didn't know where it was. And he thought it was, you know, I just wanted to be one of the things that he did while he could still walk was to show me where this monument was located. Here's one of our prescribed burns in the Pine Barrens at the Franklin Parker Preserve. This is a view from Apple Pie Hill, looking at one of our prescribed burns. We're so lucky that the State Forest Fire Service works with us to make them very hot and reach the canopy in order to create the ecological effects that you really want so that you can burn out some of the organic soil and create bare sand where things like Pine Barrens reed grass can thrive. And instead of just a cold, light prescribed burn that basically doesn't do anything except favor bracken fern and a couple of species of huckleberry or blueberry, what you want to do is have hot fires that open up the canopy, kill a few trees here and there, and also consume a lot of the built up organic material. That's what an ecological fire does. And that had been what had been happening in the Pine Barrens for thousands of years. Here's what it looks like after a hot fire. These are mostly turkey beard plants resprouting. Xerophyllum asphodaloides is a lily, and it looks like a grass until it gets its flower. And this is within weeks of a hot summer, a hot spring wildfire, the turkey beard resprouting, and then a couple of years later, with all that sun and with all that energy from the roots that survived the fire, you get mass flowerings. And they're one of the most beautiful plants. Atlantic white cedar forests used to go, the Hackensack Meadowlands used to be an Atlantic white cedar forest before we logged them away and stopped all the fresh water from coming down the Hackensack River. And now, of course, it's a brackish marsh. But in colonial times, the Hackensack Meadowlands were an ancient cedar forest with trees, stumps 4 or 5, 6 feet across. Cedars lived for half a millennia, 500 to 600 years, and they were the biggest things around when the colonists arrived, and they were all gone by before the Revolutionary War, pretty much the big ones. And we've lost about 80% of our Atlantic white cedar. They have southern species like magnolias, and they have northern species like saw-whet owls, and they're just an incredibly fascinating place where two flora and faunas are juxtaposed, northern and southern. One of the problems, of course, is deer. So there are a lot of reasons cedar forests don't regenerate. Sometimes they're just harvested at the wrong time during droughts, and they come back as shrub thickets or maple thickets. But one of the biggest problems is deer. This is Penn Swamp in the middle of Wharton State Forest, and that yellow line is a fence line. On the left, you can see in the 2018 photo, on the left, it's regenerating as white cedar. On the right side of the fence line, there is no cedar. It's just a grassy meadow with some scattered maple trees and blueberry bushes, because the deer have access to everything on the right of the yellow line, whereas everything on the left is surrounded by a big perimeter deer fence. Yet, even though we know that deer are the most destructive force in our forest for the last 30 to 40 years, the Division of Fish and Wildlife has absolutely no intention of reducing the deer herd in order to satisfy recreational concerns. The Division of Fish and Wildlife has no intention of trying to reduce the deer herd in our heavily forested areas. They have very liberal hunting rules in the agricultural areas of, say, Somerset or Hunterdon County. But in our heavily forested areas, the rules don't even attempt to reduce the deer herd. It's really pretty disheartening. We're hoping to change that with our Forest Task Force rules that may come out soon with Senator Smith's help, to try to get the Division of Fish and Wildlife to recognize natural resources and instead of just recognizing recreational needs. Here's an older Atlantic white cedar swamp. This is the Shins Branch Natural Area dedicated to David Moore and Brendan Burns State Forest. It probably dates from post-Civil War, and it's probably got 150-year-old cedars. It's probably our best, oldest cedar swamp. Housing things like the black-throated green warbler, which is a northern species. This might be its southernmost population on the Atlantic seaboard. Again, a northern species living in the Pine Barrens. We're trying to plant a lot of cedars. Here's a 2005 planting on the old cranberry flats of the former cranberry farms at the Franklin Parker Preserve. And here are the young cedars being protected by all the panic grass and other species of grass that came up in that sandy area, being protected from the wind. Also, we had a deer fence, and cedars didn't make it. And I was there yesterday. The cedars are now 18 feet tall, and it's turning into a beautiful open cedar forest with wetland hummocks in between and bladderworts, and hopefully someday maybe some of the orchids will come back. This is the pole branch, which in the 50s was known as one of the places in the Pine Barrens with more rare species than anywhere else, all sorts of rare wildflowers. And it was completely destroyed in the 1960s by the cranberry industry. Oh, here's an aerial view of the Batstow River. Just look at that magnificent oxbow down in the lower right. This is, again, a very old aerial photograph from an airplane flyover in the 1960s. And notice the sand roads. Even then, some of the sand roads got a lot of traffic, and they were, getting beat up by recreational vehicles, but mostly just pickup trucks. And since the advent of the various off-road vehicles, the problem's gotten way worse. Now at the Franklin Park Preserve, we don't let any motor vehicles in unless it's by special permission. And we don't have that problem. We have all the rare snakes. We have, we're documenting just about every species that ought to be in the Pine Barrens is there in the 20 years that we've owned the Franklin Park Preserve. All the rare snakes like corn snakes and rattlesnakes and pine snakes are there. And also most of the rare plants that are supposed to be in the Chatsworth area have been found, including false asphodel, Tophieldia, which may be endemic to Burlington County, New Jersey. It may be that the Tophieldia in the Pine Barrens is different than the other species that are recognized in the genus Tophieldia, and it might be an endemic just to Burlington County, New Jersey. Here is red-headed woodpecker habitat after a tornado and a gypsy moth outbreak. Either top killed or broke a bunch of oak trees, and the red-headed woodpeckers love those disturbed patches where you have lots of standing dead wood. And here's a baby red-headed woodpecker just fledged from the nest. Mountain laurels obviously are statewide, but especially on ridge tops in the north and throughout the upland forests, and even in cedar swamps in the Pine Barrens. They're incredibly variable in the habitats that they occupy. Notice the moth here feeding on a mountain laurel flower. And of course, they have those spring-loaded male flower parts that pop out from the little their housing and throw the pollen onto the pollinators' bodies. Lady slipper orchids, obviously pink lady slippers are common throughout New Jersey, and they suffer greatly from overbrowsing by deer. In my hometown of South Plainfield, we have a little patch of woods called Highland Avenue Woods, and we put up deer fences, and the lady slipper orchids actually came back inside the deer fence after being gone for about 10 years. So it's amazing how some of these plants can persist as root material or leaf material that you don't even notice. And then once you protect them from deer, they actually come back. Here's a plant that suffered tremendously from off-road vehicles. This is trailing arbutus. They used to be all over the sand roads in the Pine Barrens until the advent of quads that have destroyed the center line of sand roads. The center line of sand roads in between the Jeep tracks used to have tremendous wildflower diversity, and most of that's gone now. Same things with bird's foot violets in those center lines of the sand roads. There used to be so many places where you could see them, and now they're just, sometimes you find them eking out a little corner of the edge of a sand road where the wheels haven't run them over yet. There's a rare butterfly called the dotted skipper, nectaring on sparkle, the Pine Barren sandwort, and that's an open sand species. And then, of course, magnificent pygmy pines, which are one of the most spectacular ecologically unique forests in the world. Driven by wildfire. Some of these pines are centuries old. Some could even be over 1,000 years old. Roots never die. In a hot wildfire, only about between 5 and 10% of these pygmy pines actually die. Almost every single one of them resprouts from the root crown. Notice in the distance, there's a stand of tall pitch pines protected. That's Watering Place Pond in Warren Grove. And the stand of pitch pines there is protected by the pond from wildfires. So you actually have two distinct genotypes of the pitch pine right next to each other. And the only thing that causes those two different genotypes to be selected is on one side of the pond, there's a high fire frequency, and on the back side of the pond, on the east and southeast side of the pond, where wildfires can't get across the pond very often, the trees are a different genotype and they get nice and tall. Let's see, it looks like I have about maybe 5 or so minutes left. I think I'm in good time. Here's broom crowberry, a very rare species of the Shawangunk Mountains, the Canadian Maritimes, and the Pine Barrens. Corima conradii, we manage for this plant. We basically built the Great Wall of China out of pine trees around this population so that off-road vehicles can't get to it. And I won't tell you where it is because I just can't risk anybody knowing where this place is. Otherwise, it'll get destroyed in 5 seconds by somebody with a monster truck. So the only close relative of Corima conradii, the only other species in the genus, grows in the Azores of all places. This plant has a very interesting biogeographical history that would be an interesting thing for someone to study. When we took over the Franklin Parker Preserve, we tried to create a lot of vernal ponds when we restored the cranberry box to wetlands, and it's worked fantastically. Within only a few years, they were colonized by Pine Barrens tree frogs. And it turns out there's a new faculty person at Kane University that studies amphibian diseases. And so far, the acidity of the Pine Barrens is keeping out the rare amphibian diseases that are wreaking havoc with amphibians across Eastern North America. So far, we're lucky in that the Pine Barrens is not losing its amphibians. Look carefully, and you'll notice that in the grass is a timber rattlesnake. We study timber rattlesnakes in the Pine Barrens. Of course, they're also in the mountains of North Jersey. And every once in a while, we keep finding a new population here or there. There are still copperheads in the Watchung Mountains. Some young copperheads were found not long ago, a few months ago. So even in some of the existing preserves of forest patches in the Watchung Mountains, there are still copperheads. But the rattlesnakes are pretty much restricted to some of the more remote mountains, and then the reservation area in the Pine Barrens. Here I am radio tracking. Here's my daughter Natalie helping me radio track. Notice that I haven't given her any protective gear. I'm only kidding. It's a different day. And here's King the rattlesnake, a male rattlesnake that traveled 8 miles without ever crossing a road to go from his winter hibernation spot to the spot where all the males battle and do their combat dances in order to see who is the most dominant male in order to become the most favored mate or get the most matings. So we still have rattlesnakes doing their combat dances or a ritualized dance. They don't actually bite each other. They just dance and try to figure out who's the dominant one. So that's king. That's a record. No other rattlesnake has ever been traveled 8 miles from his wintering den to a breeding spot. It's thought that king was a really old snake, so he was traveling really far to try to encounter females that he had never encountered before, to get his genetic material even farther away from his normal home range. That photograph was taken by my daughter Isabel in the middle of the photo. My wife Hazel was on the left, and that was 10-10-10 that day in 2010, when it was October 10th, 2010, and we went and we radio tracked king into a swamp deep in the Pine Barrens. Great day. Our forests are getting old again. There's tremendous pressure on them to have them logged throughout the state of New Jersey. Most of the reasons for logging are unwarranted. Our forests should be carbon sinks, and we should be protecting our sequestered carbon instead of turning it into wood chips and all sorts of other nonsense and sending it back into the atmosphere. And there's a bunch of nonsense about forest health, about how logging is making people's forests healthy. And I submit that none of it works until we solve the deer problem. It's an absolute farce what's going on, where people are being fooled into harvesting their forests. And it's a big problem on state land because we're running out of big trees on private lands, and the loggers are turning their sights onto our public lands. And there are absolutely no rules, none currently, to protect any of our public lands from being logged. So if you thought that when you spent your Green Acres money to protect your forests, you're absolutely wrong. They're all open for business. And that's why Senator Smith is trying to come up with some sort of a compromise to get some protection for our public lands. And it's not going to be easy. This is the old Cranberry Flats a long time ago, in 2000. And of course, we dug them all up at the Parker Preserve to make wetlands with hummocks and ponds, and they've turned into spectacular wetlands. I encourage all of you to go to the Pine Barrens, to the Franklin Parker Preserve, and there are miles and miles and miles of trails where you can look at the restoration work and also enjoy the forests that much have been left alone for well over 100 years, as the DeMarco family never engaged in any sort of logging. Copper butterflies are unique to the American cranberry vines. They lay their eggs on cranberry and they nectar on cranberry, but they don't live on cranberry farms because the cranberry farms are flooded every winter, and that kills all the eggs. So the bog copper butterflies live along on cranberries that are growing naturally along stream corridors where the temperatures and the wind aren't so bad as out in an open cranberry bog. Let's see, just lost my ability to advance. I don't know why. It's really weird. There it is. Here's Pickering's Morning Glory Dune in the middle of the Pine Barrens. These sand dunes, in some cases, are natural. In some cases, they were created by mining. In some cases, they're just created by winds during the Ice Age. And Pickering's Morning Glory grows on these open dunes. Here it is. And we used to have 27 populations. Now we have about 13. And we only have 3 good ones. And most of them have been destroyed by off-road vehicles. Pine snakes nest on the same habitats as where Pickering's Morning Glory grows, open sunny dunes. There's a pine snake nest in the middle of a dune in deep in Wharton State Forest. And here's what I call an idiot circle. These are the places where the people come when they're drunk in their monster trucks and they just drive around in circles till their brains fall out of their heads. And that's pretty much the only way they know how to recreate. And that's what we need to crack down on, because these magnificent habitats are simply being destroyed by lawless renegades. Here's some baby pine snakes. They get stuck in the tire tracks and they fry after they hatch. They try to crawl across the dune. They get stuck in the deep ruts of the tire tracks from the monster trucks, and then they can't get out. Here's sickle leaf golden aster, a rare aster that we've got some experimental populations. They're being destroyed right now as we speak at the Heritage Mineral Site by Hovnanian because that area was not protected. That's the Lakehurst Naval Air Base in the background. That's just another shot of the broom crowberry that we have to protect from off-road vehicles. Here we are doing our pine snake studies. Here's my daughter helping us collect data, the weight, the length, the age of all these pine snakes that are pit tagged with, just like you tag your pets and know their growth rates and how long they live. And they come back to the same hibernation sites every winter. And this study's been going on with Joanna Berger at Rutgers University for 42 years. Okay, so we have to protect our forest canopies from logging. Here's an example of an illegal pine plantation of hybrid pines, completely against the rules in the Pine Barrens. And yet no one's ever done anything about it. The person who did it was the Pinelands commissioner and you never got in trouble. Highways obviously fragment population, especially of reptiles and amphibians, more than anything else. And those are the things we have to fight vigorously from new fragmentation impacts, such as the extension of Route 55, which may happen someday and cut up Cape May County. Obviously, this is the worst kind of fragmentation because this isn't even a forest anymore. It's called Forest Glen and Forest Meadows and Forest this and Forest that, but it's nothing but people and all their junk. And there's no sensitive species can live there. And so with that, some of the beautiful species that we've seen today, little quiz: Pickering's morning glory, Pine Barrens, American chaffseed, sickle-leaf golden aster. We need to burn the Pine Barrens. Don't be alarmed when you hear that Pine Barrens has had a wildfire. It's a good thing. We just have to make sure that they don't go near habitation. And here my daughter's collecting data in the aftermath of a wildfire. And here are the pine cones that open up. You can see they're only burned on the outside, and then they open up in the aftermath of a wildfire and spread their seeds. And with that, I'll stop and take questions.
There I am. That was fabulous, Emile. Thank you so much. A wonderful, wonderful tour through. And we do have some questions that I want to, I've sort of combined several of the questions into sort of larger groups to see if you can answer them. But one question that came up, which I thought was a really good one, had to do with, you were talking about some of the protected areas that, years after they were protected, suddenly orchids showed back up, or suddenly something else showed back up. So the greater question was, how do plants regenerate in an area after it's been preserved, or after the area has been degraded for such a long time and then it's protected and they come back? How does that happen? What are some of the processes?
Well, I mean, I wasn't talking about degraded areas. I was just talking about natural areas that, species are moving into from the south. Okay. We know from studies of the fungi, the New Jersey Mycological Society is documenting hundreds of new species in New Jersey, especially in the Pine Barrens, and they're all seem to be coming from the south. The people who do moth studies, moth nights have become really popular. And they're documenting all sorts of southern species moving north. So things that can move easily, like orchids with their tiny seeds, things like moths, that can migrate, and fungi with their spores seem to be able to move because of climate change. But don't be fooled, right? Most things can't move. A lot of our rare plants that, their seeds are dispersed by ants, their habitats are going to walk out from under them, right? So there's a rare potentilla at the top of Kittatinny Mountain by the High Point Monument. It's sort of like a subarctic species of potentilla living on top of the Kittatinny Ridge. Well, it won't be there in a few decades because its habitat is going up, right? But it's already at the top of the mountain. So, don't be fooled. Certain things can move easily, but the vast majority of species can't move. They can't move across the landscape anymore. The forest is too fragmented. There are too many obstacles. Or, in many cases, the agricultural lands and the post-agricultural forests can't contain any of these species because they don't have a native understory. So species can't just move like they did after the Ice Age and recolonize thousands of miles, because the habitat is completely intertwined with human activity that doesn't allow species to move. So it's really going to be complicated. But even though everybody's worried about climate change, the biggest problem in New Jersey, climate change hasn't hit yet, right? It hasn't caused a lot of extinctions in New Jersey. What's causing extinctions and populations to diminish in New Jersey is fragmentation, is loss of habitat, deer. And I think deer are the #1 problem facing our plants in New Jersey, especially our uncommon plants in the understory. I don't think there's any greater threat. If we don't do something about deer, all of our other restoration efforts will fail.
So that actually touches on another question that came up, that when you touched on the deer management in the state. I mean, I know I live in Hunterdon County, and there are plots of land that are managed by the state for deer to increase the population. What is the likelihood? What is your thoughts on where the likelihood that the state may ever come up with a deer management system in the near future?
The only way we'll ever have a deer management system, hunters are diminishing. People don't hunt anymore the way they used to. And the younger generation it's going to just diminish. The only way that we're ever going to get control of the deer population is to allow deer meat to be sold. That there got to be a system where people are encouraged to harvest deer and sell the deer meat. Because right now you can't buy deer meat, right? And a hunter has to spend a lot of money, clothes, ammunition, bow and arrows, permits, gas, vehicles. And what can they do is they can only give the meat away to their friends. And after a while, you can only give away a few deer, and you have to spend a lot of time to do all that and money. So if we don't make deer a commodity, we'll never get them under control.
Well, and the hunting culture still focuses on big bucks.
Well, there are plenty of people out there who would bow hunt and spend more time if it didn't cost them too much time and too much expense with no return. There are plenty of people who would harvest deer and harvest does. You have to harvest does, obviously, and because they're all having twins and triplets, because we've loaded the landscape with nutrients with all of our cool season grasses, our farms, our yards, our plants. The world gets green in the middle of February now, and the deer never get hungry, especially with warmer winters. So, the females are all having twins and triplets. So the only way is to make deer meat a commodity. And that's going to be tough.
It is.
Because most sportsmen are against that. Not the sportsmen. Many sportsmen want it, but the agencies are against it.
Okay, on to another question here that had to do with the New Jersey Conservation Foundation and the preservation of land, and what is part of the decision-making process on how to restore and preserve that land? What steps to take to preserve, restore land against threats from the outside, I suppose, and internally. I mean, obviously, you've already talked about the yeehaws on their off-road vehicles and trucks driving around. But what are some other decision processes that go into even decide which land to preserve?
Well, very often you don't get to make those decisions, because very often you can only buy land from willing sellers, and you have to be opportunistic. So every once in a while, you have to make a choice with limited resources. Do I save this land first or that piece of land first? Which one is more important? But that doesn't get to happen very often. Most often it's just driven by opportunity. County parks, state acquisitions, nonprofit acquisitions. Everybody works in different regions, and you just preserve land because you have the opportunity to do it. And some people, this is the most important point that I want to make. there are a lot of people, especially politicians and even some conservation groups, that are saying we have enough land, we can't manage it, why should we preserve more? And that is ridiculous, right? Because eventually we can restore land. We need to preserve the land base now so that we have it to restore in the future. Sitting around saying we can't take care of what we have, so don't preserve anything else, is just ridiculous. We have to preserve everything that we can. We need to preserve another 1.5 million acres. And we need to do it fast before it's gone. And maybe someday we'll have all the dollars that we need for restoration if we don't blow ourselves up first, right? So please don't let people fool you with this nonsense about we have enough land that we can't take care of it. Most land we don't need to take care of, right? First of all, we don't, in many cases, don't know how to take care of it except to do small projects. And in other cases, even if we know how to take care of it, we don't have the resources yet. So right now we have to preserve land and make sure that it's there so that someday, if we have the resources, we can restore it. Because we haven't preserved enough to preserve our biodiversity. So that's the main point that I want to make.
Well, there are a couple other questions that I'll try to roll them into one single ball. And it has to do with people with their own properties. Whether they have forest or they have gardens or whatnot, and they've got a degraded forest which has no seedlings in it, no nothing, because all it has is deer and Japanese stilt grass. Is there something that individuals can do on their own properties, large or small, that could enhance the ecological value of their properties? How to address that? How to fix that? You've got the forest; it's all Japanese stilt grass and mature trees. What to do?
Fence off little areas and be patient. That's Jay Kelly's doing studies now. A lot of things we're trying to figure out if it's better to plant or if it's better to just fence off areas and let natural regeneration of the species that are adapted to that site take care of themselves. Because planting is expensive and you get droughts and you get other things, it's hard to keep them alive. Whereas if you have natural regeneration, even if it's, something that's been browsed a number of times, a tiny little tree that's been overbrowsed, a seedling or sapling, if you just put up deer fences, eventually they grow up and they fill up the inside of the fence. So you have to be patient because that takes a long time. And the other thing is, if you're not going to own the property for a very long time, then you shouldn't be trying to restore a forest because the next person is not going to continue your work, most likely. But then you can do things like have pollinator meadows and short-term things. So if you're just a homeowner in the suburbs, you should be doing pollinator things and things to help out migratory animals and pollinators. If you have family lands that you think are going to be in your family for a long time, then you can do forest restoration and be patient. But you shouldn't do things that the next person is just going to get rid of, right? Because that's what's going to happen, right? Chances are that the next person is not going to like what you did. So but if you do something that's short-term, like a pollinator meadow in your garden, get rid of your lawn and make a pollinator meadow, at least that serves a purpose while you're there, right? And there are, hundreds of books written about how to do all those things like attracting pollinators and creating these little patches that are useful to animals that can move around.
I guess MPS&J needs to continue educational efforts so that the next person that moves in actually does appreciate the restoration.
Well, yeah, but think about how hard that's going to be. You have very little
yeah.
control. Right.
Well, thank you very much, Emile. This has been fantastic. Is there anything that you want to leave us with as a parting shot before we move on to the next speaker?
Keep an eye on the various websites of the major conservation groups and support, protecting the Pine Barrens from off-roading and illegal vehicles. Try to help us make sure that our public lands are not open to logging, on a large scale with no regulations as it is now. right now, you know, your county park, your municipal park, your state land that's near you, they can start logging it, and you would never even have it. There's no law that says you ever even have to know about it ahead of time, right? There are no rules. And don't let anybody tell you that the rules. The only thing that there are best management practices, and that's a joke, right? Best management practices means you're going to do something awful, and you're going to try to use a practice to mitigate how awful it is what you're going to do. They should be called worst management practices, right? Best management practice means something bad's going to happen, right? It's an admission that something bad is going to happen. And yet, you know, when you go to your town or county, or somebody comes up and says, "Oh, we're gonna use best management practice and we're gonna improve this forest," that's a crock, right? Don't believe it. It's a bunch of baloney. Just look at what happened at Roaring Rock in Washington Township in Morris County a couple of years ago, for those of you who aren't familiar with that. Or Round Mountain in Somerset County, one of the oldest, in Hunterdon County, Round Mountain, the oldest forest in Hunterdon County. It was going to be logged, and the county recreation commissioners didn't even know it, right? That was in about 2010 or 11. And luckily we stopped it. And there are incredible numbers of rare plants in that forest. And we found out about it after the trees were marked and the contract was signed, and we stopped. We got lucky.
Yeah.
So just remember, there are no rules, and don't believe anything that anybody tells you, because mostly it's a crock. That's my major parting message.
Well, thank you very much, Emile. Thank you for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Hopefully you'll be able to stay on with us some, but also enjoy your day with your daughter up there.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.